going to look at Joshua 4 through Joshua 6. If you remember, back a few weeks ago, I talked about in a sermon the rest that we have. And there are ones that I presented to you were 4 different ones. 2 of them are from the Old Testament and 2 are from the New. In the Old Testament, we have the example of the Sabbath rest when the Lord finished creating the world. And then I emphasized for you that the rest that is promised to the people of Israel is when they were leaving captivity. And so when they were getting into the new Canaan land, if you will, then they were going into a rest. And I'm not sure it's that big of a deal or not, because it's often that we sing about the rest like it's on the other side of the river, and that's that particular rest, which wasn't really talking about heaven, because the thing that I wanted you to understand is that they were going to be going to work. And of course, when we cross into our rest, that's when the work ceases. And then we'll wait to see what God has for us when we get to heaven. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we've got the rest that we receive because we have a relationship with Christ. Come unto me, all you that labor, and I will give you rest. There in Matthew 11. And then, of course, finally is the final rest. It's talked about in the Hebrew letter, and that's the rest of heaven. So as we look at a part of this, where in Joshua, the people, as we already know, have established almost completely right now the new people that they are. And that is, they were in captivity for all those years, some 400 years. And then Moses comes along and he leads the people out. He spends 38 to 39 years in the wilderness. And it's a pretty challenging sort of experience for him, to say the least. And that comes to an end. He experienced a lot of the power of God. One of the things I've been trying to point out is that these people lived by faith. And of course, what I mean by faith is they saw things, they were taught things, and they ended up believing based on that evidence. And so that's the way faith always works. You read, you study. We've got this book here to help us to understand how it is that we can be right before God, and we get faith and we trust in the words of the book. That being true, then, we see that in the Old Testament. Now, when Joshua comes on the scene, one would expect, since he was going to be doing, I guess, in some respects, similar work to Moses, there were going to be things that were going to happen which should cause people to believe in God, but also trust that Joshua is the replacement for Moses. And so, after the people are all organized and they're ready to move out, in chapter 3, verse 14, just to sort of set us up for what will come a little bit later, when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and when those who were carrying the Ark came up to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark stepped down into the edge of the water. For the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of the harvest. I mean, it really, those of you who've been over there, if you go when it's not this particular point in time, it's just like a little small river. I would call it maybe a nice, even-sized creek. But it spreads out. It did at this time for half a mile to a mile, so they say. And so, anyway, they are going to cross over, but they're going to try to remember what this means. And so, if you go down to verse 17, it says, "The priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until all the nation had finished crossing Jordan." So it seems like a long time for these individuals to be standing there and having all the people to go across. But I'm sure there are decent explanations for that. But as it comes right out, it sounds like they're standing there, and then during that time, everyone crosses over. But we get then to chapter 4, and what chapter 4 is about is, okay, now that they've crossed over, what is it that they're going to do? Now, from what you know about their history and why they went and what they were going back to, what would it be that they were going to be doing a lot in the beginning? Fighting. Okay? They're going to be fighting. And Joshua, remember, he was the guy who was selected to lead these people at this time. He was more of a military guy, as we understand, at least when he took the Amalekites and put them into their place, and they end up being kind of their first victory back when they are walking along the ways of the wilderness. Moses is still there, but the guy who's leading the fight there was Joshua, and so that was going to be his job. He was going to be more of a general type leader. Now, this is, I think, to me, kind of interesting because it sort of stimulates the imagination as to, what was the purpose of this. So, in chapter 4, verse 1 through 5, Mitch, would you read that for me, please? 4, 1 through 5. Okay, and then he says, "This shall be a sign among you." All right, now, picture this in your mind. To me, I'm thinking about what the size of these rocks might have been. I don't think, given the fact that they're going to be a memorial of some sort, or a remembrance, that they're going to be fairly good size. And so they're going to eventually put them in the river. Now, before they go to the river, where are they going to go? Where they're camping out. That's what it says there. Lay them down in the encampment where you will spend the night. And so they're all organized and they're going to do it. And he explains to them what's going to be about. Then it says in verse 7, "This you shall say to them, that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant. And when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever." So these rocks are going to be there it's going to be assuming that they're going to at least be able to see them for a while, because I don't know any tour that they have over there that takes you over to that side of the river and says this is where the memorial is for when they crossed over. But that's what it was for at that time, and I'm sure it was going to be something that was going to be stimulating to them and encourage them as they get over. So they've walked over. The Ark of the Covenant is with them. This is the symbol of God in their presence, if you will, and has a rather significant role at this point in time. Now, so they cross over the river, and let's skip on down to verse 10. It says, "For the priests carried the ark, were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And the people hurried and crossed, and when all the people had finished crossing, the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed in front of the people. The son of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle formation." Battle formation before the sons of Israel, just as Moses had spoken to them. So this is something that had been organized long before. We talked about it last time, that they were going to get the land on the east side of the Jordan and a little bit more on the other side as well. But nevertheless, they are going to land in this particular place, but there they are. They're part of the leading of the fighting. So it was going to be important for them to remember this. Now, I'm wanting you to try to imagine now what you've learned from this particular part of Jewish history. When you compare it, say, to Moses, and you compare it then, to what you're beginning to read about Joshua. Now, anything that it kind of comes to your mind, about what you're learning? Just general principles?
Well, just like Moses, the escape from Egypt,
Yeah.
part of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
I don't remember if there was memorials there at that point in time.
I don't think so.
But it said that everybody was in awe.
But it was a similar thing, wasn't it, Larry?
Same thing.
Yeah.
That they're
Right.
in awe, just like they were with Moses.
Right.
Same identical.
Yeah. The waters parted, and so how would that affect the people?
That's a miracle.
Yeah, I mean, again, when we look back in retrospect and we think what it would have been like if we'd have been there, and it just would have been, I think, overwhelming to us. And again, it at least causes me to think maybe I'm weaker than most, but I'm thinking, boy, this is really going to be the thing that really ties the knot here, and they're going to be faithful. But it doesn't work out that way. How is it that it doesn't work out that way? Just generally in life. I mean, something great happens to you, boy, you're just so filled with the Lord and the joy that is in that relationship with Him, and you're thinking, man, this is amazing. And then 2 weeks later, what happens? Go ahead, Kevin. Yeah.
Take place, and therefore you can lose excitement very easily.
Yeah. Yeah, and think about this right here in this particular case. I mean, right now, the big kind of parade experience of going in there, and then eventually they're going to start fighting. And so they're going to have their mind on a lot of different things. So I know this is kind of an old thing, but life is kind of old. Things happen over and over again. But it just amazes me when I think of what they're experiencing. And it's just like with the people when they came out of the land of Egypt, and they've got these plagues right in front of them that they've seen God do this great work. And you'd think they'd never complain again. And it's almost like they could barely wait, to complain. So it's very practical. What about the law as it related to Moses and to Joshua? Well, think about it. If the law of Moses, was it important to the people of Israel? Yeah, why is that? Just think. Came from God, right? And so if we want to be with God, the thing that we got going for us here is we have the law. Moses taught them the law, and that's one of the things that we find out in chapters 1 and 2, where that's what Joshua would say, keep the law close to you. Because that's the way you know. Now, there are other ways that we pointed out. There will be victories that they had. Remember what got Rahab sort of invited to the idea of faith? Because, she had heard about some victories that they had coming on their trip in the wilderness. And so it caused her to believe in God. So she really had this sense that I want to be on their side. And so, again, you think about the things that we learn. This is very practical. And so the people are going to be put in situations where they'll know better. They know they should trust God, but things really, really get powerful. And we're going to find out with the first sin, after they finally get their acts together with a couple of victories. And you are shocked that it happens. And of course, that's the sin of Achan, and we'll be talking about that. But look down to verse 14 of chapter 4. And he says, on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel so that they revered him just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. So what was the process here? What was the process that had been materializing here? The same thing kind of happened to Moses. What was the...
Well, the parting of the Red Sea for Moses
Right.
was one.
Yeah.
Now they're parting the Jordan.
Yeah, and who's at the center of this? Joshua's at the center of it. So it's establishing, this is what God did with Moses. He established credibility, and people believed him, at least for the most part. Joshua, it was the same way. He wanted the people to know that you can trust this guy. And we don't know as much about him, really, as we did about Moses. But there's something about him that, I don't know, there's a purity about him. Maybe it's because we don't know that much about his life. You know how that works. You know, you find out more about people, and then all the blemishes show up. But nevertheless, God exalted Joshua. And the whole idea was to lift him up and listen to this man. He is my spokesman. All right, now, so let's just go on down to after they put the rocks in the river, verse 21. Tyler Ostrowski, could you read it? Chapter 1, verse 22 down through verse 24. Yeah, excuse me, Joshua 4. No, Joshua 4, verse 21 down to the end of the chapter.
He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea, when he had dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God.
So these things, like Dave said, he compared the Red Sea and then with the River Jordan. These things were done for a reason. They weren't done with the idea of just being exciting, which I'm certain that they probably were. But it was to establish who God was, and again, who Joshua was. And so it was to provide a reason to believe in God. Now again, when you start comparing, you look at this, and I look at this, and we're saying, boy, that's the kind of evidence I can understand why people could grasp it and could get it into themselves in a way to where it could really fire them up and they could be faithful to God. But nevertheless, we know, because life is what life is, that it doesn't always stay that way, because the flesh is what? Is weak. Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so when things bad happen, we just immediately, not everybody, but there's a tendency toward just falling apart. What do I do? But the whole idea was to now prepare them to know that God is there with them. Listen to Joshua. Joshua is now my spokesman, and we're going to be good. So when we get down to chapter 5, part of this, when they just start talking about circumcision, it always makes me cringe just a little bit. But it says in verse 1, it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. So what was the purpose in this regard for these people. They had heard about what? Same stuff as Israel. Israel experienced it. They had heard about those same things, and at this point, as it says there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. So, things are now seemingly prepared for them to have the motivation to go in and do the things that they're supposed to do. They're supposed to go in there and take the land. But there's a couple of things that they're going to do before they do that. It says, at that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. Now, I don't think it means they got it twice. I don't think that's possible. But they're talking about, I believe, somebody may have another idea, but the whole idea is, okay, they were circumcised in Egypt or when they left, and now that generation is gone. And so here's this new generation, and they are now going to be circumcised. So the circumcision was a sign of what? Of a relationship that they had with God. These are my people. And so it starts back there with Abraham, and it worked its way up into the law. But it was a way to show that we are connected. What does it mean to be a covenant person? If you are a person who lives by a covenant, what does that mean? I only hear mumbling. Okay, you have a responsibility. And with that responsibility will come blessings, and if we do not obey, then there will come things that are not going to be as a result of it. But it was a symbol, whether it's sort of odd to us, this was the symbol that really showed that these people were different. Now, that was a part of it, but I think, and some of you, I'm sure, who had a chance to read this before and think a little bit more about it, something else now happens. They go ahead and they circumcise them, and then we are going to find out that they're going to partake of something. They're going to partake of the Passover. And so, in verse 8 and 9, it says, now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they recovered. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the shame of Egypt from you, so the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day. So while the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they celebrated the Passover on the evening, it happened to be the right day, on the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. Then on the day after Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, and you probably kind of lost track of this, but what stops? Verse 12. No more manna. So this manna had been, if they didn't like it at some points, boy, they must have really come to really truly appreciate it. Understanding that it came from God, but we know they got bored with it. Didn't think it tasted all that great. But it's also, if you go back to Exodus and what it says there at that particular time, if, for instance, foreigners come into their company, if they're going to partake of the Passover, they must be circumcised. So, this is a symbol, again, of that covenant. And the Passover was really the backbone of what it was that made them this new nation that had freedom in front of them. And so they're circumcised, they partake of the Passover, and so that would indicate, at least to me, that they're now ready to go. They're now ready to go. Any other ideas on that? Yeah, Daniel?
Why weren't they circumcising the little boys while they were wandering in the woods?
Let's see. Let me look that up. Why weren't they doing that? It doesn't say. I'm sure we could come up with a good reason, for it. it was, I suspect, waited for this rather important and significant time. And so we are going to become the people that we should have been. And so this new generation will be circumcised. So that's the most logical way, in terms of my understanding. Yes, Jessica?
The only sense they just had been circumcised on the way, we could hypothesize that maybe it was a reflection of the generation before them, since they had gone so far away from serving God, they just said, what's the use of circumcising kids?
Yeah, that's possible.
That could be it, but we don't know for certain. For some reason, they just didn't circumcise
Right.
while they were wandering.
Well, I think, there's no way of knowing for sure, but I do think there was a point now in time where they cross over the Jordan River, and the reality would be that this is going to be a new beginning. Yeah, Carrie?
And I can see why the timing of this would be critical, because they're entering a land where they're going to be face to face with different people over and over.
Right.
It becomes a reminder they are different.
Yeah. No, yeah, and that to me is the most logical, and it would have been kind of crowded into this one moment in time, if you will, and they would have known, hey, we're different from these people. But this is a symbol of not some just physical thing about who we are, it's our relationship with God. And so, at this point in time, they're ready to move into their time of conquest, I guess, if you will. So, as one might expect, in verse 8, now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they recovered. So, it wasn't like it's like, okay, let's go hit the field here. It was they had a chance to get over it. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the shame of Egypt from you. Now that kind of goes back to Jessica. I've now rolled away the shame of Egypt. So this has now happened. We're now going to the promised land. That's behind us. And so I think that's probably another good reason why they did it at that time. So it says, verse 10, when the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, which is just right near the river, as you might imagine, they celebrated the Passover on the evening of the 14th day, as I have already read. And it goes on down, to skip down to verse 13. And it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, now this is one of those kind of strange situations. A man was standing opposite him with the sword drawn in his hand, and Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our enemies? Now, what would that cause you to think? I mean, does this guy look so unusual that he was afraid to approach him? No, it doesn't seem like it. But it says, are you on our side or are you not on our side? And he says, no, rather I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord. And the question is not whether, I'm going to be on what side. You're going to be on my side if you want to be able to succeed. And so, he says, now this is where things change. He said, no, rather I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord. And then what happens? Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down, and he said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like the burning bush. Okay, so people talk about sandals in different commentaries and things like that. And if you want to do more research on that, you might understand a little bit better if that's what's important to you. But anyway, of course, when you read of an account like this, it always gets a little confusing for people. Who is this guy anyway? And there are individuals who came and they received a certain amount of at least fear. I don't know if you always call it worship, but this is an individual that now it's clear that this guy said, I'm what? The captain of the army of the Lord. And maybe that didn't settle too well with him. And then he finally figured it out. And so for what does this mean for him right now? Let's go back to motivation. Go ahead, Micah. You look like you're trying to hold your hand up, but it's all right. I'll get you the next time. Yeah, go ahead, June. Yeah.
So what does it mean for Joshua?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, this is, could be Jesus himself.
Yeah.
He recognizes, obviously, he knows who the people are, and he's the leader. Joshua's the leader. Where does this random leader just suddenly appear out of nowhere?
Right.
It's got to be some kind of supernatural.
Some people do say that they believe this is one of those appearances of, the Son of God in the Old Testament. A lot of people believe that to be the case, but I don't think it certainly has to be in this. Well, he did worship him, but there are other people who get worshiped who aren't actually God, but they are the servants of God. And when they get in their presence, the people, they get very, very excited, and some of them do worship. Go ahead. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, if he is a representative of God, then that also would cause that to happen. Is your hand up? Yeah, okay. I was trying to figure where his hand was coming up, but it was going right around Margot, and then kind of was right over her head. Go ahead, Vance.
Well, I picture that Joshua and Moses spent a lot of time together, right, while Moses was still alive, and probably heard the stories that Moses was saying when he encountered the burning bush.
Yeah.
He worshipped and his sandals came off. You almost just imagine in this moment, perhaps Joshua has a realization that, just in that moment, Moses was selected by God to
Sure.
lead the people. Now this is his time to be selected by God to lead the people, even though that they crossed the Jordan. But even as they're about to embark on the actual conquest of the land, it's
Right.
just a confirmation of, no, I am with the Lord, and he's on my side, and
Right.
we're ready to go.
Yeah, I think that ought to have had an effect. If he knows through his studies in the old law, he would understand who this captain is. That there are beyond us individuals who are fighting, if you will, some spiritual warfare, if you want to call it that. Certainly comes out in the book of Revelation. But he's obviously very moved by this guy and his presence. And when we looked at, for instance, the burning bush, was God actually there? I mean, is it presented that way, that God was actually there? Go ahead.
Yeah, there are many instances, including that one, it's an angel of the Lord.
Right. And so this may be an angel or the angel of the Lord. That's possible. But obviously, it's a powerful presence of God. Just like when Moses was there at the burning bush. That was a powerful presence of God. I mean, in the case of Jacob, he's with something that's physical, it's God, and he wrestles with him. I mean, he doesn't seem to be intimidated at all by it. So, I mean, these things are a little bit different, depending on, how God wants to manifest himself. So, verse 1 of chapter 6. Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel, meaning what? They're very afraid, and so they got all the gates shut. Now, who do we know who's living there that's going to survive this thing? Rahab. All right. She'll come up a little bit later. But the Lord says to Joshua, I've handed Jericho over to you with its king and the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. And you shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram horns, in front of the ark. Then on the seventh day you shall march around the city 7 times. You know, I got to tell you this. I've always gotten confused about the going around and who did what, and then what's going to happen. Is it going to be twice time? You know, and I always overdo it. You know, the way I understand it, and some of you geniuses can tell me. Okay, they go around 6 times, and then on the 7th time they do what? Not yet. Not yet. Then they go around 7 times. Okay. See, even you guys are confused on that. But I for the longest time, I would say they went around 7 times. But it's actually just 1 time a day, and then 7 times at the end. Now, they've just been told the city's yours. And then they're told, okay, all we got to do now is march around the walls of the city, and it's going to be yours. Again, so what are you thinking? Now, I'm suspecting, that the guy who's been in the presence of the captain of the Lord's army, to whatever extent we can understand that, he would have been impressed. But what might you have thought had you been there? Or even, the people of Israel. What would have been easy for them to think? Yeah, Dan. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to do this, and this is going to win? Okay, so and that's a reasonable thing, but we understand and we know that if you are going to trust God, you must trust in His words. And if this is what God wants us to do, and this is what Joshua is instructing us to do, and who's Joshua? The representative of God. They're going to have to understand that this is going to be enough. This is what we've got to do. Now, there's quite a description of that, and there's even a repetition of it. There in verse 15, it says, "The 7th day they got up early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same way 7 times." This is the 7th day. Remember now the priest, and remember the ram's horns. So they marched around the city 7 times, and at the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpet, is that you, Charlie, that said that the trumpet would get blown? All right. That was certainly a part of it. Joshua said to them, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, but the city shall be designated for destruction. It and everything that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from things designated for destruction, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the designated things and turn the camp of Israel into something designated for destruction and being disaster on it." Finally there, "But all the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." All right, this becomes very, very significant. And one of our most well-known Bible stories is going to come out of this, the sin of Achan, where, again, people are going to be reminded that when God says something, that you are expected to obey God. Now, it reminds me a little bit of Ananias and Sapphira, that, here's all this good stuff that's going on. They've got a little rumble from the government, but at the same time, things are going well. And then they just play the hypocrite, and they do what? They lie. And then what happens? They just drop dead. Doesn't say they were struck dead, just says they dropped dead. So we're going to see that God expects them to obey Him. And so if I tell you this is what you're able to do, that's exactly what I mean. You are not going to be taking anything out of this town, and if you do, what do you take out and where do you put it? What?
Put it in the treasury.
Yeah, of the temple. It wasn't a temple then, but it was a tabernacle. All right, so that's what you're going to do with it. And that's what I mean. Now, I think if you kind of imagine this wasn't the first war they've been involved in, but can't you imagine, that the excitement might have been a little bit over the top, and it would have been very easy. And here you are, you're doing what, in some respects, would be an awful thing and destroying these people, but at the same time, this is a part of what God's plan is all about. This land had been promised, and they are now going to take this land. As I've mentioned this before, it would not happen until the sin or the iniquity of the Amorite was full. That's found, I think, in Genesis 15:16. So there is a thing about this that I guess it might make you understand that God was not going to take these people when they were living righteously, but when they'd gotten so bad, then God's judgment was they should be destroyed, because they had gotten to the place where there was apparently nothing that could be done to change them. Okay, so let's go ahead and so verse 21, they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out the woman and all she has out of there, just as you have sworn to her." I mean, it seems like it would have been real easy to just forget about these people, but this was the promise that was made. Yeah, go ahead, Larry. No, sorry. No, go ahead, Linda, and then he can follow you. Ladies before gentlemen, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
The curious thing to me is they marched around the walls fell.
Yeah,
We knew that Rahab lived on the wall.
yeah.
So why didn't they get her out before the wall?
Because that part of the wall was still going to be there. That's yeah.
They left out one strip.
Yeah, we did sort of skip over that when, as it says down here in the people shouted, the priests blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the only explanation I have for that is that she was somehow protected. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
The resemblance between this story and Noah.
Yeah,
The world is destroyed because of its evil. Noah and his family are protected because of the ark. Noah because he was a man of God. His family apparently because they were connected to Noah.
right.
Well, here's Rahab. She is the single one in that entire community that's left. She and her family.
Right.
Because she had faith.
Yeah, there is some parallel there. I mean, the deal was from the beginning, she was the one who said, "I want you to save my family too," and they went along with that. But that's a good parallel. What else? Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I was thinking too, and all that family does have to at least have enough confidence in what Rahab's telling them to stay inside.
Yeah.
All the chaos is going on, because I mean that's part of why
Yeah.
she had that part of the wall stays up, is because the commandment was for them to stay within the house as all of this havoc is going to be taking place, and anybody who leaves will be cut down.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can only imagine what it was like. I mean, I'm going to believe they had confidence. But again, when we look at this, we have to try to understand, this is a lot of what you find in the book of Joshua, is there is destruction of people. And you have to sort of understand that in the plan of God, like in one particular case, Larry mentioned when all the people were destroyed except the family of Noah. So this is not unusual. But there's a larger plan that's working here, and that is we're working toward salvation of all people as a result of it. Go ahead, Jessica.
Another thing is, and I read this a long time ago, I don't know if it's accurate, but I read that when they've done archaeology in the area, that when they excavated the area of Jericho, they found evidence
Yeah.
fell over from the outward down.
Right.
Not inside down, outward down.
Right.
Which would have been impossible for conquering nation unless, of course, God made it come down that way. And made it come down flat, because that's not how walls come down. They don't come down flat unless they're given a purpose to.
Right. Or there's something outside the realm of nature.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever may have happened, in terms of, what it was like, for them, I'm sure that they probably were a little bit afraid when they're seeing all this destruction and the walls fall and they're still somehow protected, and they still come in there and get them, and they retrieve them from it, just like Joshua promised, just like the spies promised, and just like God promised. Go ahead, Lupe.
I'm just curious, what group of people were this? Were they like Canaanites and Amalekites? Who were they?
Well, they were from the city of Jericho. I'm not quite sure what the tribe was. You could probably do a little bit of looking in that regard. Yeah, these were people who were all worshipers of idols. All of them in that area. The whole section that we call the land of Canaan, they were all worshiping idols. Certainly the leadership was, there may have been certain individuals, even though they were told to destroy them all, they didn't do it. And they continued some sort of an abiding with them. But God, that was part of the problem. They didn't destroy them, and that's why they so easily fell back into idolatrous worship. Okay. Next week, chapters 7, 8, and 9. 7, 8, and 9. All right, thank you. Time's up.